Well, it's 7 o'clock, so I think we're about ready to get started here. We're excited to do this new weather update here with Brian Bledsoe today. And so we just want to welcome all of you in and just we know we've been having a lot of questions about what the weather's doing, what it's been like this spring, and kind of what the outlook is for this summer. So we're excited to learn about that. My name is McKay Erickson. I'm an account manager here at Red Summit Advisors. We also have Stephen Red here with us that will also be a host and kind of doing some questions and stuff at the end. We just want to remind everyone you can enter questions in the chat. Feel free to enter that anytime. If you have a question or come up with a question, we'll be reviewing those and we can ask Brian those at the end. Um, and then also just feel free to put in there where you're from, where you're watching from tonight. And then just also a reminder to customers, we sent out printed copies of your interval statements just last week. So if you have any questions on those, feel free to reach out to your agents and we can get those questions answered. But with that, we'll just kick it off and turn the time over to Brian and thank him for doing this for us.
All right, guys, let me go ahead and share my screen here and we will get underway. I think it's going to share. Can you guys see it yet?
Not yet. It's showing
Looks looks
why.
looks like it's
There we
loading
go.
here.
We
Yep,
got it
there we
ready.
go. All right. Well, good enough. Well, it's been a little while since we've chatted last, but we've got some things we want to go over, obviously, short and long term. So, for those of you that may have not seen this type of webinar in the past, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with kind of the near term, and then we'll kind of branch into the longer range type of stuff. But I always like to kind of look back and see what's happening or has been happening across the entire country for the past several weeks. And what you're looking at here is the short term drought indicator, and it takes into account really for about the past 3 to 4 months as far as what's been going on. And it's very easy to see who's been wet and who's been dry here. The wet are the greens, the blues, the purples, and the dry areas are the yellows, the oranges, and the reds. So you've had, really good moisture. Southern California, Arizona, far western New Mexico, Colorado, the front range of Colorado has been doing okay. Parts of the northern plains, most of Montana, parts of Idaho, Nevada, those areas, we've obviously had good snowpack going on, but you've also had some really heavy rain going on across parts of east central Texas and along the Gulf Coast, and then also up in the Corn Belt. So the big takeaway from something like this is that the overall pattern that's been occurring really hasn't been one of drought or a dryness enforcing type pattern. The weather pattern's been variable. We haven't been locked into any one particular weather regime over a period of time. And everybody, at least a lot of people, I shouldn't say everybody, has been able to score some pretty decent moisture off and on over the past several weeks. But if you look at something that's a little bit longer term, you also get a flavor of what's going on. And it does tell a little bit of a different story in certain places. You can obviously see most of the Intermountain West and the Rockies have been doing very well in terms of moisture. When you branch things on beyond that 3 month period, you still have some dry spots in Northwest Washington and the chimney of Idaho and Northwest Montana. But the crux of the dryness in that long term has been felt across southern New Mexico, West Texas, and then on up into the Corn Belt. And it's interesting to note because this dryness that you see in the Corn Belt region is actually been taking place for the past 3 years. And before this spring, there were some areas up there across Iowa that were running 3 year deficits on the order of about 40 to 50 inches in terms of precipitation. That's really significant. So while they've been very wet recently, they've got a ways to go before they make up all of that ground. So to put that in perspective there, we really, on a long-term composite graphic, you have the haves out west and the have-nots kind of in the center part. But in the long term, it doesn't necessarily tell what's been happening in the short term. That's why I showed you that graphic originally, which I think was very important. Let's see what the percentage normal has been over the past 60 days. Again, where the browns and the reds are, that's where it's been excessively drier than average. Where you're seeing the greens and the blues, that's where it's been wetter than average. So there have been some dry spots over the past couple of
Hey,
months.
Brian.
Again, yes, sir.
I'm still seeing that first slide. I don't know if that's the case for everybody else, but I'm still seeing the short-term drought indicator.
Hmm.
Okay, are you seeing
I've
the
got
same?
Yeah, I am.
your guys' isn't advancing.
Nope, still on that very first slide.
Oh, and it's showing kind of your slide view as well.
Weird. Let me hang on a second. Let me stop sharing right quick. I'm not sure what would be going on there.
Wouldn't be a good webinar without a few technical difficulties, right?
Exactly. I'm
There we
not
go.
sure.
Okay. So now
Was that
now we're
better?
on the yeah, past 60 days.
You are on the past 60 days. Okay. Let me I'm just gonna go to the previous slide here
Yeah, yeah.
to see if it changes. Did it change for you guys?
It
Yep,
did.
that
Yeah.
works.
That's weird. I'm not sure what was going on there. Okay. So
Maybe refresh one more time, Brian, on this slide. You have the short term and the long term. What are the ranges for? You said the short term was the past 3 months, more or less. And if you
and
go
the
a little
long
bit
term is
farther than
beyond
that,
3. It takes into account like the it's more akin to like what the drought monitor would be like that's cumulative over an extended period of time. So the short term again takes into account that 3 month period right there. That's what you're looking at currently. And then
okay.
this is the long term where you can see that it definitely tells a different story. So as I was saying, if you look across eastern Nebraska, Iowa, parts of Kansas, Missouri, those areas in many cases have been pretty wet in the short term, but they have some pretty substantial deficits to make up. That's why you're seeing the differences here. And then if you look out west, well, we've largely been pretty wet for a while. You know, that takes into account, you know, even what we saw last year with that tremendous snowpack that was going on out there. So the reason I show the differences is because for areas, the long term still shows you areas where drought still has some sort of a foothold, if you will, and then you can kind of pair that with the short range and say, well, what areas are going to be problematic? Well, if you look at the short range again, you see southeast New Mexico, West Texas, and that short-term dryness is building on top of that long-term dryness. So it's a good analyzing tool for that. Okay, does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So again, let's go for the past 60 days in terms of percent of normal here. And you can see reds and the browns. That's where it's been largely drier than average. If you have the greens and the blues, that's where it's been wetter than average. Not a whole lot different than what we were talking about with the short-term dryness, but it does show that there have been some areas over the past 60 days that have been significantly drier than others. Again, Northwest Washington, Chimney of Idaho, Northwest Montana, those areas have been missing out. Even parts of central Nevada, Southwest Utah, and then you spill out into the plains, and there's some areas from southeast Colorado into south central and southwest Kansas that have been struggling too. So while the pattern doesn't necessarily scream drought over a wide area, there are some areas that are still, struggling. The next couple of weeks really kind of has that similar flavor, and that kind of owes to the pattern that we're in terms of the wet stay wet and the dry stay dry. So you've got a dry anomaly going on for the next 2 weeks in the Pacific Northwest and parts of the northern Rockies. A large part of Montana and the northern plains stay wetter than average, and then you have some dryness that comes down into the central plains. That's off the Euro model for the next 2 weeks, but the GFS computer model pretty much is telling the same story with those areas. So that kind of gives you a good credibility with the forecast within the modeling that it is actually recognizing that the wetter staying wet and the drier staying dry. For those of you that are interested in something a little bit more short term like that. Um, when we're dealing with long range stuff, it largely starts and stops with what's going on in the oceans. And there are a few things to take note of here. First of all, we at this time last year were dealing with an El Nino episode. And El Nino is the abnormal warming of that oval shaped area that I have there off the west coast of South America. Uh, And since we've had that, for the past, say, 8, 10 months, we were dealing with a weather pattern that was largely reminiscent of that. But in the past few months, the El Nino has gone on the way out, and we have flipped the script to a developing La Nina, which is the exact opposite. It's when the ocean water out there becomes cooler than average, and that swing has been pretty significant in the past month or so. While that is happening, you still have cooler than average water from the Baja out toward Hawaii and across parts of the Northeast Pacific. The other kicker here is that the region of the Atlantic Ocean between Africa and, say, Cuba is a lot warmer than average. And you might ask yourself, what's the significance of looking at this? Because what you do is you look at what's going on right now and you try to look back into history and pair where the ocean temperatures were similar to this and see what happened with the overall weather pattern. So the key players here are that negative PDO, that cool horseshoe of water right there in the Northeast Pacific, the negative PMM from the Baja to Hawaii, the coming of the La Nina, and the Atlantic meridional mode, that positive area, that warm pool out there in the Atlantic. Those four things will largely determine kind of the evolution of the pattern that's going to be going forward. So that's right now. Let's see what the Euro seasonal model does with the sea surface temperature anomaly forecast from now through November. And you see it pretty much erases all of the warmer anomalies there in the central Pacific off the west coast of South America and replaces them with cool anomalies. While that's going on, your Atlantic Ocean is still staying warm. And up top, you still have the resemblance of a cool signal, if you will, from the Baja to Hawaii and across parts of the Northeast Pacific. So what this model is suggesting is that a lot of the ocean anomalies, the way they're stacked right now, are probably going to have a pretty good shot at standing pat. The one thing that I am a little bit unsure of is how far does that real warm anomaly in the North Pacific get to the west coast of the United States? And I'll show you the significance of that here in just a second. That's what the Euro is saying. The NMME model, looking at the same thing, is not only more aggressive with bringing on La Nina sooner, but also it brings on a much stronger episode than what the Euro model was showing. It still kind of has the same tail, though. I mean, you've got the Atlantic, which is warmer than average. You still have some cool water there from the Baja to Hawaii and across parts of the North and the Northeast Pacific. So they're very similar. I just think the NMME model here is a little more amped up in terms of what it thinks this La Nina episode is going to do. If I had to lean on one model or the other right now, I would probably favor the NMME model, just simply because this transition that's gone on from El Nino to La Nina has been fairly rapid, and the NMME model, I think, is picking that up a little bit more clearly than the other. For those that need a refresher course on what La Nina meant to us the last time it was here, because remember, from 20, 21, 22, we had La Nina episodes going on. And so what I've charted here for you, these are the precipitation anomalies January through December that averaged out for those 3 years when we dealt with La Nina episodes. And you see that it brought a lot of dryness across pretty much the western half, if not western 2/3 of the United States. That did include California, Utah, Colorado, all out into the midsection of the country. The only real wet areas were the far northwest part of Washington and across the southeastern US. Now, at face value, you might say, well, we can take this and we can analog it forward because we're moving into a La Nina. I feel good about that technique if the La Nina was already here. All right. So we don't have it totally here yet. We're still kind of in the transition mode. So I think it behooves us to look and see what happened during those years where we had the transition taking place. So what I've done for you is looked here with El Nino to La Nina analogs, June through August. All of those years that are shown there, those are years when we transition from an El Nino to La Nina. And these are the precipitation anomalies that averaged out for all of that. So a couple of things you
Brian,
see
one
right
question.
here. Yes.
Do we typically transition from El Nino to La Nina during the spring, summer, and how long does that transition typically take? You kind of alluded that it might be happening a little quicker than normal, but can you?
The transition, the immediate transition from an El Nino to a La Nina, after you've had 3 consecutive years of La Nina prior, is pretty rare. Okay, it's very rare. the thing to keep in mind, whether you're in an El Nino or La Nina, what usually happens is you will see some sort of a transition in the springtime. So like this El Nino basically died in March. Uh, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll kind of flirt with neutral conditions, if you will, for a few months, and then late summer and into the fall, that's when you will go into a La Nina episode. It usually doesn't happen like this. This is I would have to go back and be sure about this, but I'm almost positive that this is the most rapid transition from an El Nino to a La Nina that we've had since we've been keeping records on this. So I think that's significant because if we're dealing with some sort of an anomalous event here in terms of an El Nino to a La Nina transition, how well are the computer models handling something like that? That maybe they don't have a whole lot of experience handling, with that type of a rapid transition. So I think that's what's important about looking back through history here and cherry picking those years when we did see that. Uh, and he might look at this map and say, well, what does all the white mean? That just means that there is no uh, positive anomaly or negative anomaly in terms of what the precipitation averaged out to during those years. And I think that's kind of a hallmark of a transition period. You're not seeing one extreme or the other. The one thing that does bother me about this is we're already dry in southern New Mexico and West Texas. And historically speaking, that's where dryness initially gets a foothold here. You can see that with the yellow and the orange there over West Texas and Southeast New Mexico. And what that usually means is that dryness and that drought gets a foothold there. And if we do not see a suitable monsoon season, that dryness blows up. Okay, so I have been looking really for about the past, I would say at least 6 months at that particular area to see if El Nino would fix it. And El Nino largely missed southern New Mexico and West Texas in terms of moisture. And we're already out of it. So, the time has kind of come and gone to see a significant amount of moisture that would grace that area that would completely reverse that dryness and we would be out of the woods. Okay. So June through August, I know you look at that and say, well, Arizona's in the white, so's Utah and Colorado. I don't think that is going to tell the whole story here. And I'll show you the reason why here. Because in September and December, through December of all of those years, you see what happened right there. When we transitioned to the full-blown La Nina, we completely dried out the southern part of the country. We moistened things up out the Pacific coast, but the tell here is if you miss the monsoon, that becomes a real problem, and it becomes a real problem in a hurry. Because you go into a period of time into the fall and into the winter season when you're already behind the eight ball because you missed a wet season. Okay. So I think that that's something that's important to look at. And I have cherry picked one year in particular, and I've been looking at this particular year for a few months now, and that year is 2020. Because if you look at the sea surface temperature anomalies over here on the left, that's 2020. And then over here on the right, that's what's going on right now. There are a couple of things that pop off the map. We have back in 2020, we had cool water from Baja to the Hawaii. We had a La Nina episode that was probably a little farther along than what we have right now. And we had a really warm Atlantic. So over here on the right, 2024, and I snapped this just yesterday, you've got cold water from Baja to Hawaii. You've got a La Nina episode that's taking place and coming on. And you have an Atlantic Ocean that's even warmer than average. And the Atlantic Ocean being that much warmer than average is significant because what it does is it weakens the pressure patterns across the Atlantic Ocean, which will inevitably help to shove moisture into the midsection of the country and even farther west. And that colder than average water from the Baja to Hawaii, in many cases, mean a diminished or in some cases a failed monsoon season. Okay, this is in my mind the ticket that needs to be watched going forward here. How these sea surface temperature anomalies change in the next couple of months, because it'll loom very large for what's going to happen with the monsoon. And I'll show you what happened back in 2020 for the month of May. This is what happened in May of 2020. We were wet across the Pacific Northwest. Well, have we been wet in the Pacific Northwest this May? No, not necessarily. Not up across parts of Washington, Northwest Montana, and Idaho. We have not. But we have been very wet across East Texas, Eastern Oklahoma, Arkansas, and we've been dry in New Mexico and West Texas. There are some hits and there are some misses here with what happened in May of 20 versus what has happened right now. So I don't want you to look at this and say, well, is this going to be a diagram of what's going to happen going forward? I think it's more important to look at what happened in June to August of 20, where we had a largely failed or diminished monsoon across the southwest part of the country. And keep this in mind. I know a lot of folks say, well, why would I care if I'm in Wyoming? Why would I care if the monsoon fails? Because that monsoon moisture gets entrained in the flow and pivots up through the mountains and creates showers and thunderstorms during the summertime for not just Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, but also for Idaho, Wyoming, and as far north as Montana. So if that monsoonal moisture is diminished or in some cases fails, you shut a lot of it down across the Intermountain West. And I think out of everything, this is the one thing that I would be most concerned about in June to August is that monsoon being severely diminished or in many cases even failing this year. And I cannot underscore that message enough for producers right now because there are just so many signals in history that are screaming a red flag at me with this right now. So I want to be very upfront about this. I also want to qualify that by saying when I get a question, say, well, it's not going to rain. Well, no, it always rains in the summertime. Okay, but these are showers and thunderstorms, and if they don't have the adequate moisture that they need to do their thing, what you get them to pop up, and then you get a bunch of lightning. Well, if you're already drying things out, and you've had really 2 years largely void of timber fire, things can. You see where I'm going with this, guys? It can go from bad to worse in a hurry. So for those that are watching that may have ground with some timber on it, or that butt up next to a forest or whatever, I think we need to be very mindful of that this year. That I think this quote unquote, here in Colorado we don't have a fire season. We can have fires year round, and I know that's a lot the same way for many states in the West. So I qualify that as saying, okay, well I have grass and brush fire season, and then we move into timber fire season. I'm talking specifically about timber fire season being a threat right here, June through August. And it could possibly last even a little bit longer because if that La Nina signal really kicks into high gear, that also forebodes a dry fall. So you kind of keep that going. All right. So, and that leads me to my next slide. This is what happened in September to November of 2020, where again, the dry stayed dry throughout that whole time scale, with the exception of a few areas up over northwest Montana, parts of Washington, then the southeast United States. So the monsoon being problematic, and by problematic I mean being severely diminished, sets the table for some problems as we obviously roll into fall too. So that's the history side of it. Let's look at the computer model side of it. These are the latest long range models. This is the Euro seasonal model. Again, the brown drier than average, the greens and the blues wetter than average. And this was its forecast for May. And it's been doing a pretty good job. We've been wet across Montana, parts of the Dakotas, northeast Colorado, and in the midsection. And we've largely been dry there across far west Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. But I want you to watch what happens down there in Mexico as we go into June, because those dry anomalies only get stronger in Mexico. And in the month of June, we look for that monsoon pattern to start in central Mexico, and then it makes its way northward. So you're going to see a theme here that's pretty consistent with what I'm talking about. As we move into July, you see the dryness that's still there. Most of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and as far north as I mentioned, in up toward Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. And that's why I'm specifically concerned about the timber fire season. While the west stays drier, you see the midsection still stays largely wetter, at least into July. And then if we push into August, it's the same flavor. Again, doesn't mean that it's not going to rain. Just simply means that the odds are stacked for considerably drier than average during the heart of that monsoon season. All right. If we go to September, same story. That dry pocket is firmly anchored over the four corners. We go to November, or I should say October. You're looking at the same story. And then I think we have one more here to November. No real change. The only change is that the Pacific Northwest and parts of the Northern Rockies start to light up with moisture. And that's very typical during a La Nina. Okay. So let's look at the NMME model. This is for June, and it is even more stout with the dry signal down there in Mexico, coming northward through New Mexico and on up into Colorado. But notice it does have the wetter areas up there across Montana, parts of the Dakotas that have actually been getting some water. If we go to July, that dryness remains anchored in the same spot, and it also spreads north to Wyoming. August, same. September, that dryness expands even more, which is typical of a La Nina, dries out the fall. Go to October. I know you guys have seen this movie before. That's November. And again, it also has the Pacific Northwest, British Columbia, wetter than average versus farther south, which is drier. And this goes into December. And once you're locked into that, see, this is the real benefit of being neutral. All right. And so you mentioned earlier about how they change and when they come on and whatnot. The benefit of an extended period of time where you're neither in El Nino or La Nina, it allows the atmosphere to kind of reset to average, and it increases your weather variability without getting locked in these weather regimes that both La Nina and El Nino produce. Because once you're locked, you're locked. The weather variability goes downhill. So if you're getting water, great. You're getting water and you're going to continue to get it. But if you're not, that's when the dryness and the drought really becomes problematic with something like this, like an El Nino or La Nina, because it's very tough to break that regime. Questions?
Yeah, questions. Typically, I mean, we talked a little bit about the transition period. A La Nina event historically lasts for how many months, how many years are they stacked? I mean, we'd like to get back to a neutral pattern, like you were saying. What's the time frame look like on that, would you say?
With the way the Pacific Ocean is situated right now, which it's in a cool decadal phase, and by that I mean it's been in that kind of a cool phase since 1998. So really, for the past quarter century, the Pacific Ocean has been in a phase that favors more frequent and longer lasting La Nina episodes. All right. So on average, a La Nina would last probably anywhere from, say, 8 to 13 months. All right. So just on average for about 10 months to a year. And El Nino lasts on the order of about 6 to 9 months with the way the ocean is stacked. And that's one of the big reasons why we had that 3 year La Nina. The way the Pacific Ocean is set right now, it favors things like that. So I think that's also some of the benefits of looking at history and seeing what these types of patterns have produced in the past. It's never going to be a perfect roadmap, all right, but at least it's going to give us an idea of what to expect when we're projecting out, months ahead of time. All right.
Okay. Well, we've got a few questions coming in the chat. Let's see. Joe Wheeling wants to know what temperatures are going to look like in the Southwest this summer and fall. I would assume hot and dry would go along with that La Nina forecast, but can you expound on that?
Yeah, I'm worried about some heat. Absolutely. Especially if you have a diminished monsoon, that means you've got less moisture in the atmosphere, which allows it to heat up more. If you've got less moisture, that means you've got less clouds. If you've got less clouds, it's more heat. If you've got less clouds and moisture, you've got less rain, which means more heat. Yeah, I'd be concerned about some heat across really the western half of the country. Yeah, this summer.
Can I
Mhm.
can I ask you, Brian, along with that, you mentioned kind of the concern for a failed monsoon. Is there anywhere in the country that if there is a weaker monsoon that part of the country will still get some moisture? Like you mentioned, La Nina sometimes does bring moisture into the Pacific Northwest. Is there anywhere that would be that way if we have a weaker monsoon?
From the monsoon standpoint, I think there will still be moisture come into the Southwest. All right. So that's why I said if someone asked me, well, or says it's not going to rain, I'm like, no, it's still going to rain. It's just you're diminishing the not only frequency but scope of those really heavy rains that we see a lot of times, especially in July and August for the Southwest. The area of the country that I think has the best shot to be wetter than average this summer is probably going to be down along the Gulf Coast into the Midwest, because I think that warm Atlantic Ocean out there is going to produce a banger of a hurricane season. And I think those storms have a real good shot of getting into the Gulf of Mexico. The problem with the moisture that gets in the Gulf of Mexico is a lot of times it never even sniffs areas farther west. It will stay in Texas and then shear farther east and north on up into the Midwest. It has a much better shot of doing that versus coming farther west. For me, if I'm looking at a hurricane season for moisture and I live in, say, Arizona or Utah, I'm looking for the hurricanes that come in from the Pacific. And you saw that cooler than average water from the Baja to the Hawaii, and that typically shuts down the Pacific hurricane season. So you amplify the Atlantic hurricane season and you shut things down in the Pacific. You see what I mean? Um,
Gotcha.
but at the same time, while all that's happening, see, last year's monsoon season wasn't a good one either. But if you remember, the remnants of what at the time was Tropical Storm or Hurricane Hillary rolled up through the West and the Southwest, and it put down a whole lot of water in a short period of time. And that really skews what that season looks like. Because if you look at it just on average at face value, you'd be like, oh, well, you guys did okay. No, it really amounted to one really big event that kind of tipped the scale completely in one way. You see what I'm saying? Like it. So I think we have to be that's why I'm so concerned about this year, is because on a year like what's coming up, you don't have the luxury of getting a more active hurricane season in the Pacific. The deck is stacked against that. I'm not saying it can't happen. There can always be something that can happen. But if you're looking at trying to make a forecast like this, you're looking at the forensic evidence before you. You're like, well, the chances of that happening don't look very good. So I would stress to plan for drier and plan for hotter if you are in the west and the southwest part of the country. I think that I don't want to say that's a safe bet, but that's my bet right now. Oh, and I'm seeing Lori's question right here
Okay.
about the red flag days, abnormally high winds in the Rockies. Lori, I think as we transition, case in point, Woodland Park. I mean, we had a foot of snow in Woodland Park yesterday, and we've had some great late season moisture along the Front Range. So I think in terms of wind, it's always going to be somewhat windy here along the Front Range during the summertime. But what I'm more concerned about is what happens in the fall and the winter, where after a season where we didn't have a good monsoon, we've dried things out, and that keeps that quote unquote fire season going for a longer period of time. Because back in 2020, we had big fires in Colorado. We had Cameron Peak, we had the East Troublesome fire. I mean, we consumed a lot of wood late summer and into the fall. And it was because of that failed monsoon that allowed us to do that. So I think in terms of red flag, we're kind of getting a little bit out of that red flag season, Lori. But what I'm more concerned about is timber fire this summer, and then that fire danger continuing into the seasonal change as we go into fall with that, if that makes sense. And to Matthew's question here, Matthew, I'm not sure where you are, but you say, is that a dry forecast through the fall months as well? Yeah, if you're in the West and Southwest, yes. I not only do the computer models support that, but also history supports that in particular.
Good. Let's see. We got a few more questions. Valverde and Sutton County, Texas. Not sure what areas those are. Maybe McKay or Brian.
Yeah, I'm believing that is southwest,
Okay.
if I'm right.
So
Uh,
probably have been dry and expect to see a little bit more of that in the future.
I can hang on just a second. It was Valverde County.
Yes.
Hang on here. I'm almost positive it's farther southwest, but I'm going to check anyway. Yeah, that's Del Rio basically. um, yeah, the southwest, I'd be concerned about that. And that's especially because it's been generally dry down there. I think areas farther east have a better shot, but even Valverde County down there, if you're looking at around Del Rio, there can be some moisture from the Gulf of Mexico sneak up the Rio Grande that can make it that far west. I would to answer that question a little more specifically because I've done some work for some guys that had a ranch down in northern Mexico, and I told them specifically, you've got to be concerned about being how far west you are up the Rio Grande because the farther east you go, if you're in Laredo, I say your chances of having moisture during the summer are better than if you're in Del Rio, just simply because you're farther east and you're closer to that moisture source um, down there in the western Gulf of Mexico. It's easier for that moisture to get to you to develop those showers and storms than it is, farther west up the Rio Grande. So I don't want to say that Valverde is going to be a complete shutout, but I would be more worried about Valverde County and Del Rio than I would say down the river in Laredo, if that makes sense. But I would say fall and winter, I would be very concerned about a lot of dryness. I mean, you saw what the maps are looking like both historically and on the computer model. They were not kind at all to really all of Texas.
Really, the east side of Texas, the ace in the hole is having the hurricane season that potentially strong out of the Atlantic coming up the Gulf of Mexico that would really help them potentially.
That's right, and they've been wet. And I'm not saying Del Rio's been wet, but I'm saying the east half of Texas has been wet. So if you shove water in the ground, just when you get the daytime heating, you bubble that moisture up and you build clouds and you build showers and thunderstorms. If the farther west you go, southwest Texas is really struggling in terms of moisture because we didn't have the El Nino to grace them with the moisture this year. So, I talked to the Southwest Texas and Cattle Raisers Association, and I'm like, look, East Texas is going to be very different than West Texas. And I'm like, I know I'm really splitting the atom here with that statement, okay? Because of course it's different. But when you magnify that trend by drying West Texas and moistening East Texas, again, you get locked into that perpetual weather regime that becomes really tough to break. Um, and I think that's something we have to be prepared for across the west and the southwest part of the country.
Let's talk about snowpack a little bit for the West and Rockies and fairly decent most places. I think we saw that. What do we expect on that? Does temperatures start to rise and that snowpack starts coming out of the mountains?
Well, in Colorado, we got a really nice boost this weekend with the snowpack. So, I mean, we're probably not going to see a complete melt off here in Colorado until later in June. And maybe even early July to put that in perspective. However, I think once we turn it on, it's going to be on. I think the that's one of the reasons I was saying it was so critical, especially here in in Northeast Colorado or Southwest Nebraska or Northwest Kansas to put as much water as we could in the ground early because I think when it shuts off, it's going to shut off. And once it shuts off, that's when we're going to get hot because that means the atmosphere will dry out and we can build that heat more effectively. I think that that's one of the reasons we haven't seen a lot of heat early this spring so far. And that's great. The longer we can delay it, the better. But I am concerned about once we shut it off, it's going to get hot. And I think the heat that we generate in the atmosphere will be prolonged a little bit later in the summer and into the fall. Um, so kind of backloaded, if you will, in terms of the heat. But in terms of a rapid melt off within the snowpack, I don't see that happening right now, simply because we have really good snowpack for the most part in there. We have plenty of snow to melt, is my message.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
very good. I know that's how we've been here in Utah. Our weather has gone back and forth, flip flop. We'll have a nice, pretty warm week, and then it'll get cold on us again. And so I think all of us would rather prefer that snowpack stays in the mountains as long as possible, and comes slowly if it may be in end of June, July, and stretch it out as long as possible. But anyways,
Yeah, 100%. And I don't see any extreme heat setting in for the rest of this month. You know, here we are halfway through May, so that buys us another 2 weeks, and that we're already into June, you know, at that point. And I do think the we will see a pretty noticeable shift though out of this pattern once we get especially into mid-June and beyond, where, like I said, once it switches, it's going to switch.
okay. Let's see. We've heard a little bit about cloud seeding in California. Will this impact the forecast, or how does that impact, I guess, the West as far as what you know?
Uh, a couple of things about cloud seeding. One, you got to have clouds to seed first, and it depends on where you're seeding those clouds. You know, how far upstream from your location are you seeding those clouds? If you've got aircraft seeding your clouds right over the top of you, chances are those clouds are going to go downstream and benefit your neighbor and not you. Okay, so it really depends in terms of how far upstream, you know, the cloud seeding is taking place. uh okay, also, do I think is cloud seeding a cure all for this? No, there's no way. Is there evidence to show that it can enhance rainfall? There is, but as I said, it depends where they're seeding those clouds. Okay, I think that that's really the important part.
Let's see. One area that we struggle a little bit with is Northwest Colorado, Wyoming. With El Nino and La Nina, it kind of sits on the border of which way it'll fall. Any insight on what those people should be expecting these next couple months?
I would be more concerned about a dry summer and then the moisture returning as we head into late fall and winter. So I would say, you know, in especially because in those locales, you know, the monsoon season is very important. And if we don't have that good flow of moisture coming up from the south and southwest, or even if we just diminish that moisture a little bit, it's going to make for a drier than average flavor to the average, you know, when we go through the summer months. But historically speaking, once we get into fall and then winter, that corner northwest Colorado and on up into Wyoming, that's when they start to actually see some better snowpack, and that's when the moisture comes back.
Let's see. We had another question about out in Russell, Kansas. They've been dry. They've seen very little rain this spring. Any any reasoning for that? I mean, I guess it goes back to kind of we're in this transition period, but their area can expect to be dry the next little bit, and maybe see some benefit from that Atlantic hurricane season. But any advice for that area?
They've just been unlucky.
Yeah.
And that's just pure and simple. There's a stretch that really you know, ran from until yesterday. Scott City got some pretty good water, but it ran across Scott County and Ness County, and it pushed eastward into Rice County, Kansas. If you look at the you know, in fact, I'm just gonna bring up the map because I think it tells the story.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, More than if I can get it up here. Let me just backspace here, ways, guys, because it'll make a whole lot more sense once it's being shown. And yeah, I mean, there's some places in Kansas yesterday that scored between 1 and 2 inches of rain, and it was in the northwest part of the state. And the way the thunderstorms have been coming through, it's been missing certain spots, and that's what thunderstorms are all about: the haves and the have-nots. Even just going down the road a few miles changes the scope of things a lot of times. And if you look at this is the map that will be coming up here. Yeah, it's right there. Okay. Now this is for the past, that was for the past 60 days that I was showing you. If I narrowed that down the past 30 days, it's been pretty wet across northwest Kansas, but a lot of that rain has not made it far enough east. It's been soaked across most of Nebraska during that time, and even southeast Kansas. But where you're seeing the brown from southwest Kansas into the red there in central Kansas, it's just been unlucky. We've had rain south, we've had rain north, we've had rain west and east, but we have not been able to bring storms across. And someone might say, well, what's causing that? I don't know. It's just the way the pattern is right now. If we were not getting the rain that we have seen in northeast Colorado, northwest Kansas, Nebraska, then we would be talking about a larger scope of a problem here. It's essentially just been how these storms have been developing west and how they've been coming through. That's just been unlucky to that region. It doesn't diminish the fact that it's been dry or droughty, but it's one of those things. If you're not getting the rain, it doesn't matter if it's raining 3 miles down the road. You're not getting the rain, and it's a problem.
McKay, any other questions that you have?
No, no, this has been great. This has been very helpful. A lot of ranchers just asking what they need to do to plan for forage going into the fall and winter. And I think this has answered some of those questions. So
I think it
we're good.
resonates really clearly, because there are years where the signal is more clear than others as far as the weather is concerned. And I've been consulting PRF stuff for a long time. And this is one of those years where the history shows what La Nina does to parts of the West and the Southwest. And when you stack the history with what will be happening eventually here, I think it'll be a pretty easy decision for a lot of ranchers to base their coverage off of. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of times we default to thinking about PRF, where our coverage is, what months could possibly be below average. But on the flip side of that, as an operation, a lot of guys start thinking, yeah, like McKay said, what am I going to do for forage? How's my winter permits? How are they going to look going into the fall? And what am I going to be doing to keep my livestock fed? And so I think this will help answer some of those questions. Then they can get a baseline for their operation going forward.
I think so. And I know a lot of ranchers obviously butt up next to, Forest Service ground, or they may have timber that they actually own, on their property or whatever. And I cannot underscore that enough, that we have not had fire to deal with lately, over the past couple of years, really, in a big scope. It's been a very quiet time for the past 2 years. And I think that quiet time is over. I'm pretty concerned about what lies ahead for this summer in places.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they've done their job, managed where they can, and we'll see if Mother Nature cooperates and go from there.
Yes, sir.
Good. Well, thank you, everybody. Let's see. Our next webinar is going to be in August, so you can put that on your calendar. We'll take a look at the weather again at that point. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop them on our website. There's a section for the weather, and you can drop them there. But anyways, feel free to sign up for that August webinar, and we will see everybody then.
Thank you, guys. Be well.
Thank you, Brian.
Have a good night. Take care.